So there's two different types. There's scamming center, which is like an apartment building or an office building located in, say, downtown Sihanoukville in Cambodia, which is accessible by law enforcement group. And then there's a purpose-built scamming compound, which is like a walled city in a rural area. So if you think about the size of a city and what actually goes into a city, you have dormitories, which are 4 or 5 stories high, and they are one-room apartments, and you might have 6 to 8 people living in them in bunk beds. So there's only just enough room to move. And then there's office buildings, which are, again, 4 or 5 stories high, and they will have rows and rows and rows of desks. It's a massive open area, so the scamming bosses and the scamming supervisors can see everything that's going on. Everybody is watched 24/7. There's CCTV cameras all over the compound. There's also a brothel normally on each site. You have roving patrols on the outside of the compound, and then heavy security on the inside of this compound. That could be an ethnic armed group, or it could be a private security force that's paid by the scamming bosses. So you're really under a microscope in those compounds. And once you're trafficked in there, there is no way out unless you either pay a ransom or someone is able to rescue you in some way.
Welcome to The Human Trace. Behind every headline, there's a human story, a trace of someone's pain, survival, hope, or fight. This podcast is where we sit with those stories, the ones that dominate the news, but carry layers we rarely hear about, the ones that deserve to be known, not just reported. These are conversations I've been having for years with friends, survivors, with people trying to make sense of the broken system. And we kept thinking, more people should hear them too. So here we are, The Human Trace, conversations that can't wait. I'm Helen Avadiar-Nimbalker, and I'm so glad you're part of the conversation too. Today we're talking about a crisis that's escalating across our region, one that's stolen lives, wiped out life savings, and left thousands trapped in silence and suffering. I'm joined by 2 friends and co-hosts for today's episode, Mechelle and BC Tan, as we look beyond the calls and messages to the human costs behind scam centers. This isn't just about fraud, it's about trafficking, torture, organized crime, and a growing shadow economy built on exploitation. Some of the people behind these scams are perpetrators, yes, willing participants in a criminal network, but many others are victims themselves, lured by fake job offers, trafficked across borders, and trapped in compounds where they are beaten, raped, forced to scam under the threat of violence. These scam centers didn't appear overnight, right? They have been expanding across Southeast Asia in places where instability, impunity, and organized crime collide. And this has become what we now understand as forced criminality, a form of trafficking where victims are coerced into committing crimes against others. There are 2 sides to this crisis: the millions who have lost money and the hundreds of thousands being abused behind the scenes. Both are victims of a system that feeds on vulnerability. Today, we want to bring that system into the light. Mechelle and BC, so glad you're both here. We've had this conversation so many times behind the scenes, and I'm really grateful we get to have it here today. Mechelle, want to kick us off and introduce yourself?
My name's Mechelle. I've been working in Mass Tech for almost 12 years now, running an anti-human trafficking organization and one of the first organizations on the ground to respond to human trafficking with victims coming out of the scamming compounds in Myanmar. We've been on the ground working directly with role-type police and social welfare and immigration since day one.
I'm BC and based in Singapore. From a career perspective, I've been an investigator for coming 20 years, and I look into a number of things, including illicit trafficking, human trafficking, organized crime, and money laundering around the world.
Here's the hard truth. This is now a global industry. Experts are comparing it to the drug trade. That's how big it's getting. Billions of dollars are being lost by victims, ordinary people, and we're still only scratching the surface. These scams are being run with the same level of coordination as some multinational businesses, with recruitment, tech support,
finance departments, and even HR. Is Southeast Asia really the main hotspot for scam compounds, BC? And how much of what we hear about them is actually true versus oversimplified?
The short answer is yes, all things that you've mentioned are prevalent and they have happened. Maybe I'll pick on the geography as a starting point. So yes, in the recent years, Southeast Asia has become a major hotspot for these human trafficking syndicates, scamming compounds and scamming centers. They tend to, interestingly, concentrate in a number of cities within Southeast Asia. Historically, these scam centers, perhaps not scam compounds per se, but the scam centers have been uncovered in many countries around the world, both within Southeast Asia and external to Southeast Asia. So the situation, while somewhat concentrated in Southeast Asia at the moment, is a global issue and has been observed in many countries around the world. Now, when it comes to the human trafficking aspect and how they get there, the typologies will evolve. They have evolved. But the predominant one in Southeast Asia has been fake job ads.
Okay.
So that's what I've observed and what has been relayed to me from both the NGOs on the ground as well as law enforcement agencies within the region. Although there's also been cases where individuals have been in normal or usual employment in those jurisdictions, but then have subsequently been kidnapped or promised certain employment that obviously was not legitimate, then found themselves incarcerated or in these scamming centers and these scamming compounds.
So what you're saying is there are people who respond to fake ads, but there are also people who are forced into these scamming centers and not necessarily go in voluntarily because they're responding to the fake ads.
Yeah, I mean, I like to keep, ideally it's clear cut and binary, but the reality of the situation on the ground is a lot more complicated than we'd like it to be. But the short answer is again, yes. So the few anecdotal cases that I can speak of, you have individuals who are working in, I suppose, legitimate jobs on their own free will in jurisdictions where they have then been kidnapped and then forced into some form of slavery or human trafficked situation where then they are forced to conduct the scams. There have also been cases where I'll say volunteered scammers, so people who are there knowing that they are conducting illicit scamming activities, who have then also been kidnapped by other scamming operations where they are then forced to conduct their criminality.
So from experience in Mesot, when we've had victims come out of the scamming compounds, we've had victims who have applied for a fake job. They've been trafficked into the scamming compound, exploited, and then for whatever reason, they've come out. Then we have, like BC was saying, volunteer scammers who know that they're going into scam, but then at some point, they either get sold to another company or they get exploited and forced to scam without wages, and then they end up coming out. That third type of person, I would say not victim, is career scammers who they knowingly shop scamming contracts. They are not trafficked in. They travel into the scamming compounds. They do the work and they're actually perpetrators. And then they would commit the scams knowingly, earn a lot of money, and then come out. So when you're on the ground and you're doing a forensic interview with victims, you have to be able to profile and ID which category they fit into before you can then make that recommendation to the government and help them report. So the way people are normally getting into the compounds is, like we were saying, applying for those fake job ads. They would apply for a job online, whether it's on social media or maybe through a recruitment agency or an ad they've seen. Sometimes they'll have agents that will approach them, or they might find out through a friend of a friend of a friend, someone offering jobs in Thailand, or you might actually have a face-to-face meeting with an employment recruitment agency. Once you apply for that job, you might have to go through a series of evaluations or tests for your language competency, because for the majority of them, they want victims who will speak English. So you need to read, write, and speak English. There are some companies that will take them at varying levels, but normally you have to do some kind of competency test. Once you've passed that, if you've been identified as someone they would want to give the job to, which is 99.9% of the time they give you the job, you travel all the way, and at the airport, someone is waiting with a sign with your name typed on it. And so it looks official. During the whole time, if you ever have any red flags come up, Because a lot of people have said to me, well, I wouldn't be stupid enough to fall for that. But everything looks legit. And when you have red flags come up, you always have your recruiter, which we would call an agent, they're actually your trafficker, in touch with you the whole time. So you say, hey, this has happened. Is this normal? And they reassure you the whole time. So they're constantly debunking those red flags that are coming up. So you think, oh, and I'm in a foreign country. It might just be the way they do things here. It's okay. I'll chill and keep going. Up until people really are trafficked all the way. They're put in a hotel. They might get a knock on the door at 3, 4 in the morning, and everything is rushed and in a hurry. There's a different process depending on which compound you go into. People get to the compound and they're like, hey, this is not what I signed up for. Are we still in Thailand? Like, you said the job was in Bangkok. You get to the company and the company will say to you, now you have to scan. No, but I applied for an engineering, that was software engineering position, or I applied to be a school teacher or a hotel manager. That was fake. That's not the job you've been brought here to do. You've been brought here to scam people. Now, will you scan? Everybody always says no. And then that's when the torture begins.
You know, one of the things that really hit me is how organized this whole operation is. We're not just talking about a few bad actors. I mean, these compounds actually train people. They're taught how to groom victims, how to avoid being flagged by platforms, how to build trust really fast, and even how to mimic real customer service. According to investigative reporting and experts, these scam workers are given scripts, personas, and psychological tactics. It's like a dark version of the corporate onboarding, and it's all designed to make the fraud look really legitimate. Let's talk about numbers and statistics. What are we looking at, and what are we thinking about the statistics that are out there? Victims from over 40 countries were held in scam compounds in Southeast Asia. In Myanmar alone, an estimated 120,000 people are believed to be trapped in scam operations. Victims include people from China, India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Taiwan, and even all the way from Africa and the Middle East.
Well, here's the thing, we'll never know, will we? The number, well, first of all these compounds, be it scamming compounds, be it scamming centers, they work covertly under the radar. So we'll never know what the true statistics are. They could be less, but they could also be a lot more. But what we're certain is, based on corroborated intelligence from the ground, from NGOs and many others who work to support and rescue victims, law enforcement statistics, families of victims who have been obviously very vocal in the public eye, trying to get attention to this issue. We know for sure that there is a significant issue. We know the statistics indicate that it's one of the fastest growing types of human trafficking, but we'll never really know what the true scale is.
The thing is, this isn't isolated, right? It's not just happening in one country. Organizations like IJM and other global watchdogs have reported they're seeing this explode. And we know this. Scam compounds are popping up all over Asia, but also in Africa and parts of Eastern Europe. Some of these places have entire industrial parks dedicated to scams. Governments either can't stop it, or in some cases, they're just turning a blind eye.
So how I understand the differences between a scamming compound and a scamming center. So scamming centers tend to be one operator. So one boss, one owner, one operations. There could be multiple working together within the floor, but they're all independent proprietors. Now, what scamming compounds and how they really started popping up just before COVID. And then COVID sort of really took off in terms of an expansion. What are designed to look like industry business compounds, emerging markets. I think there definitely was a business case underpinning these development initially. The idea that you could create a business park and independent businesses can come in and set up in these emerging markets to benefit from cheap labor, from access to certain markets. Now, COVID happened. Unfortunately, a lot of these business cases fell through, and these large-scale compounds needed to be filled up. And that's really when the scamming centers or scamming operators then started. And it wasn't only the scammers. The online gaming businesses moved in as well. So it was a mixture of gray market and black market actors coming into these large compounds and filling them up. Now, again, back to how the estimates were derived. There was a certain mixture of a few methods in terms of how people estimated the scale and therefore the number of people in each compound. It was really sizing up the compound, making a calculation of how many people could fit in them, That's one indicator of how you size the scale, but also taking reference from successful law enforcement raids where they had then rescued X number of people. So then combination of both gives us a reasonable estimate of what these types of compounds can contain in terms of victims, and then therefore the scale multiplied by the number of compounds within the region.
That's more Cambodia, Laos, and Philippines, right, BC? With Myanmar, the scamming compounds started around end of 2019, early 2020. So it was before COVID, but they were very much purpose-built as illicit business parks. So we had online gambling was mainly up north of Mirawaddy in an area called Shuegogo. There's a Yatai city there. And then just down north of Mirawaddy, there's some casinos, so online gambling outfits there. But the scamming compounds were, as far as we can tell, really purpose-built for online scamming. It wasn't a diversification from online gambling into scamming. They were built at mass scale. KK Park was the first one in Myanmar to be built. They ironed out the kinks in how that park was operated. So the modus operandi has changed over the last 3 or 4 years in how they actually conduct business, how they interact with the illicit businesses there, but then also how they traffic in victims and how they treat victims, and then how they turn over victims. That's changed a lot. And then now they've secured more land and they're reproducing that on a mass scale. The issue with scamming compounds in Myanmar is they're all based in rural areas that are controlled by ethnic armed groups, and there's no rule of law there. So the sitting government is based in Yangon, the Burmese government. They're also in a civil war right now with the ethnic armed groups, but the scamming compounds aren't actually within their territory. They're in ethnic armed group territory and controlled territory. So you have this constant back and forth between the sitting Myanmar government and the ethnic armed groups in civil war, but then you also have these illicit business parks or these scamming compounds able to grow and thrive and expand unchecked because they are only in an area that's controlled by ethnic armed groups. They don't have a sitting government or a working law enforcement that can actually approach these compounds and do raids and investigate. They are controlled and protected by these ethnic armed groups. So they're able to grow and expand unchecked.
In early 2024, following conflict in Myanmar, over 1,200 foreign nationals were rescued and surrendered from scam zones. Thai officials recorded a rise in cross-border trafficking cases as victims fled from Myanmar into Mesot. Reports from UNODC and global initiatives show that rescued victims often face persecution and deportation in their own country. We've seen some headlines recently, rescue operations, changes in government tone. Do you think this is real traction or just a small dent in a much bigger operation? What do you guys think?
So do I think this is real traction? No. I think this is a very lucky time for those 7,000 that have been taken out of the scamming compounds. While it is very good for those victims to be able to get out and be repatriated to their home country, that has not actually changed what's happening in the scamming compounds. There has been no stop to the work that is being done. All the construction continues, the companies continue to operate, and there are still thousands of victims trapped within each of those compounds. So they obviously range in scale and size. So there's some compounds are a lot smaller than others. But when you're talking about victims being rescued and then the scamming operations shutting down, even the day that the ethnic armed groups went in and took out groups of people, victims were still made to go to work. And so scamming operations never actually stopped. And what happened is the ethnic armed groups went into the scamming compounds with lists from embassies and NGOs of known victims that were in there. When they were asked, do you want to go home? They said, yes, get us out of here. And they only took the victims that weren't performing well or that were causing a problem or had health issues or were refusing to scam or tried to escape. So if you were not that ideal victim, they got rid of you. So they went in and rescued 7,000 people, but they took out the people that the scamming compounds or the companies didn't want in their company operating. And then they've trafficked more people in since then.
How are these people being released? How did they agree to release the 7,000 people? What made this happen?
So this is the second time China has spoken up and then leveraged the trilateral agreement between Thailand, Myanmar, and China to
negotiate or to force this release of victims. This is the second time it's happened. We had the mass release in, I think there was 1,280 earlier last year. So this is the second time it's happened. And it was all centered around that influencer that was trafficked in, and he was rescued within like 4 days. There is a lot of international pressure right now, especially from those three nations working together towards getting people out. However, the ethnic armed groups have only come to the party so much. They've agreed to, yes, okay, we'll get people out for you. They've put out statements saying they don't agree with human trafficking. They don't partner with the scamming compounds. But they've also just recently put a statement out saying they're not going to do any more rescues. If they were really against these scamming compounds and human trafficking, they would not stop until they got everybody out. There was a lot of pressure from government. They went into the scamming compounds. They spoke to the company bosses. They handed over the lists and they pulled out people they didn't want to have in there anymore.
And here's where it gets even darker, right? Because this isn't just about tricking people. It's part of a whole underground financial system. I read this article on The Economist where it outlines how the money flows through crypto offshore accounts and shady shell companies. It's classic money laundering, but now it's being powered by scam labor and forced crime. This system is feeding back into weapons trade, trafficking, and even political corruption in some regions. It's not just a scam. It's an economic engine built on human suffering.
Actually, I want to expand is an important point, but we'll sort of go back to the basics. These scamming operators, the criminals that work with the scamming operators, the money launderers, the entire criminal ecosystem, they are here not for an ideology. They're here really just for the purpose of profit, right? And at the expense of human traffic victims and the expense of many others. Many of the vulnerables, they're exploiting the vulnerable to make profit. They're obviously very logical and clever about this. So they look for vulnerable persons to exploit. They look for vulnerable jurisdictions to exploit. So we have seen the frightening expansion rates within Mewadi and broader Myanmar, obviously in a conflict zone, obviously in a country where central government has very little oversight and control. That is an obvious loophole that these criminals have exploited. We are also seeing them expanding in countries where the economic conditions, the capacity of the governments to enforce the law has been compromised. So that's sort of a similar pattern. And also when they come into a jurisdiction to operate, they'll bring along other criminal typologies, one of which is corruption. And what corruption does is it hollows out the country and it compromises both the political will as well as the capability for a country to address these issues and tackle these criminals. It is a malicious cancer that can take over a country. Now, moving on to the next portion, which I feel is actually important, with human trafficking, with transnational crime, very particularly with this online scamming epidemic, we have to be very clear. It's really challenging how law enforcement works. Because law enforcement, by its basic premise and design, enforces a law within one jurisdiction. The situation that we are dealing with and talking about, you have scamming operations in a border town of a sovereign country, which has no ability to control that. That's one. Scamming victims of multiple other countries around the world. You have a transit nation, transit jurisdiction, which arguably is not complicit on either side, but also is very much part of the equation. Victims that come from many countries else around the world. So it's truly a global issue that we admit. But from a law enforcement perspective, it's difficult to map the scam victim to the human traffic victim and everything in between. It will require a lot of intelligence. It will require a lot of collaboration between multiple law enforcement agencies and at a scale that has never been done before. So that's fundamentally why, in my view, the world has not been able to rally itself to address this problem effectively. So while I do agree that it's somewhat seasonal, there are some political maneuvering or, there's political motivation for people to do things. I'm hopeful that these specific cases will allow law enforcement to work collaboratively, develop a model in which they can then replicate for other subsequent cases.
Yeah, I think we are all really hopeful for that. I want to go a little deeper about the human cost, what we don't see, right? We're talking about how they got to where they got to, but what really happens behind the scenes, behind the scam numbers are human beings enduring trauma. Victims are beaten, shocked with electric batons, starved, sexually assaulted. Many are young, from low income or migrant backgrounds, and deeply in debt. Survivors talk about shame, fear of going home, and stigma, and even after they've escaped. So, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have published testimonies from victims describing 18-hour shift punishments and torture. Right? These are all just statistics that we can get online. And that's why we are here today to talk about some overview of what really goes on behind those doors, right? Survivor care is extremely underfunded in Southeast Asia. We all know this, with just few trauma services. We hear so much about the scams, but not enough of the people. So what are the survivor stories telling us that the headlines are missing?
I think we need a more intended study on this, because it's an important one. It's going to impact multiple generations into the future. I see uneven or imbalance in economic growth. I see high unemployment rate in emerging markets. Income disparity as one of the key drivers why people need to look external to employment opportunities, and why they have to rely on hope. As Mechelle shared the experience of those ultimately ending up in these compounds, there's the incremental red flags, incremental discomfort, but the big voice in the head is hope and a lack of a choice in sustenance. So that needs to be addressed. I have a few fears. So one of the books that I reflected on when I got to this topic is that book we all read in English class, Lord of the Flies, right? What happens when you let a whole bunch of young people take over an island? Increasingly, they get more violent and more out of hand, and chaos pursues. So my fear is that the victims learn ways of doing this and perpetuating this, and somehow they feel that they have earned the right to do this to other people. So my first fear is that the victims start perpetuating the situation into other countries. And we've seen that, right? Some of them who have been trafficked have become human traffickers. So that's the first fear. My second fear is the lack of social awareness and the support for them to reintegrate back into society. Unfortunately, we've seen the stigma with both human trafficking victims as well as scam victims. How do they then repair themselves from the trauma and reintegrate in a meaningful way back to society, or are we just going to cancel them from it? And if we don't find a way to reintegrate them, some of them end up either coming back because they can't reintegrate, or they refuse to leave, actually, some of these areas. So we're going to lose an entire generation of young people in these key jurisdictions, which are already challenged and underprivileged.
That's exactly what I've been thinking about too, the long-term fallout. Because, trauma, hate, shame, they don't always explode in the moment. Sometimes they sit buried for years and then show up in cycles of anger, isolation, or even violence when no one's watching anymore, or assimilating it into society and communities. And you get a whole set of community that's now sitting on a landmine of anger and rage and violence just waiting to erupt. These are what I call delayed vulnerabilities. And while we're all hoping to see every person free from these compounds, I keep asking myself, and I keep hearing conversations about how are we preparing for that freedom? How are we making space for that healing, reintegration, and the possibility of some might carry this pain long after the rescue is over?
What is the extent of violation of human rights and torture and abuse that goes on there?
I don't think it would actually get much worse, to be honest, depending on the compound that they're trafficked into, depends on how badly they're treated. So if you just scratch on the surface, they're working anywhere from 14 to 18, maybe 19-hour days, because if you don't meet your scamming targets, then you're forced to stay in the office until you reach, or someone in your group reaches a target, and then you can go and sleep for a few hours, and then you have to come back to work. Movements are restricted and limited. You can't leave, and you can only go to certain buildings within the compound. Your passport, your identification is taken off you. So even if you could leave, you then don't have that one document globally that we rely on to prove that we are who we are. Then there is the torture element. So there's physical punishments, things like excessive squats, push-ups, stair runs, laps around the yard in the sun. And then it gets much, much worse, anywhere from someone beating you with their hands or maybe a weapon of some kind, a pipe or chains, to using a taser. And then it gets very excessive where you are locked into torture rooms or dark rooms with no light. You're handcuffed and then you're beaten and tortured in different ways. There is also a gender-based violence element to it as well, where men and women are sexually assaulted and raped, either by scamming bosses or supervisors or other victims. So you are preyed upon in many different ways and you're exploited in many different ways, not just forced to scam.
So let's land this and we can circle back to a lot of what we've touched on another episode. Are we evolving fast enough to respond to how these scams are evolving? It's growing faster than we can catch up. Are we learning things fast enough? Are there knowledge, intelligence being gathered fast enough?
Are we evolving and learning fast enough? I don't think so, no. Are we evolving and learning? Yes. But I think we're still too slow and we're behind the 8 ball because a lot of countries still haven't taken this issue seriously. So they don't understand the scale of what's happening. And so that now they're scrambling to try and respond. I know that there is a task force being stood up in Southeast Asia among different Asian nations, and it's not governments, it's purely law enforcement task force working together. So that does give me hope that down the line, as that grows and they get some parameters around that, and then they start to work together, we can actually have a targeted response then. However, that's still in its very early stages. So these things are going to take time to set up. Infrastructure takes time to be put into place. And then you have to, like the National Referral Mechanism, the way that you process and protect and identify victims, it takes time to iron out that process, to work out the kinks. So when you're getting multiple nations to work together, it's going to take time for them to all get on the same page and then have that targeted effective response. So I do have hope. I think it's going to have to be long-term hope. It's not going to be a one silver bullet quick fix. It's going to have to be a collaborative, long-term committed effort.
Collaborative, long-term committed effort. So what role can ordinary people, tech companies, or even influencers, whoever's listening to this, what role can all of us play in pushing back against this?
Simple low-hanging fruit is prevention and awareness. So learn about it, spread it around, educate people, educate those around you.
Mechelle and BC, I couldn't thank you enough for co-hosting this episode with me, having such an important conversation. There are a lot of people talking about scam centers, what's going on there, forced criminality, this crime against humanity, and rightfully so. But there's still so much more beneath the surface. We only scratched the top layer today. There are deeper stories, heavier truths, and questions we haven't even touched yet. This isn't a one-off episode. This is the beginning of a longer layered conversation. Thanks for being here, and you'll hear from us again next week. Thank you for listening today. If it stirred something in you, keep the conversation going. You've been listening to The Human Trace. And until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, every trace tells a story.